We're tuning in to a new episode of War Diplomacy, a podcast where we explore the complexities of international politics and the many facets of today's global system. My name is Fabio Almada, joining you as another day from Brussels, and here with me is my fellow War Diplomacy host, Armis Zinke. Hey there, Armis. How are you? How's it going for you?
Hello, Fabio. Doing very well. I've been waiting to do this episode for a while. It's one of my key specializations. I would say, without further ado, let's start straight into it.
Today's topic, it's super interesting. Today we're diving into the topic of energy and how it's influencing and reshaping our world. I'm sure that our listeners as well are a bit curious why you're so interested in this topic. So I got to ask you, what's your personal or professional connection to the world of energy and energy markets?
Yeah, if you had asked me when I was 17, 16 years old, when I was still in school, and tell me that I would work in energy one day, I'd be very surprised because back in school, I was really bad in maths and physics and chemistry. But already back then, I was really fascinated about climate change. And yeah, I started studying political science, and I was fascinated around this question of what can politics do to fight climate change. And energy is just a major aspect here. 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the energy sector. And that's why I joined an energy consultancy company, and it helped clients to become more energy efficient and to deploy new solar capacity. This would allow them to decarbonize their electricity use. And I learned that energy is actually something that I really enjoy and I really like. And I decided to dedicate more of my professional career to this field. And that's why I went to Brussels, because Brussels is essentially at the helm of the global energy transition, of the renewable energy transition. Europe is where it all started with solar and wind energy. And that's where I work for a renewables advocacy organization. I specifically wanted to give this disclaimer that I work for a renewables organization because, just as a matter of transparency, I will try to do everything today from a perspective that is as neutral as possible. But of course, I'm somehow biased towards renewables. That's my journey here. I'll do this today as a private person, not as a representative of a renewables organization. And I'm happy to give you my insights on this field.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting conversation, Armis. I think that energy is such an interesting topic that goes way beyond than just the supply and demand of energy. Of course, there's the whole policy and political elements. I mean, energy is intrinsically connected to international politics. And I think that is why we thought it would be a great topic to discuss in this episode, where in this podcast, we talk about international politics. But Armis, before we go and start analyzing this acute relation between energy and international relations, geopolitics, why don't we just start with like a quick general Energy 101 recap, maybe a little bit of that historical evolution, where energy started, what is energy, and why it's such a main component of today's economic and political fabric.
So what fascinated me about energy when I started working in that consultancy is that I realized that everything around us, anything aside from pure nature, is somehow related to energy, because we needed to manufacture this stuff using energy, and we needed to transport it to its final location using energy. So in other words, one can say energy is everything. Everything, it's powering our lives. So what is the definition of energy? What is it? It's such a broad, big term, but we can say that it is the capacity to do work or to produce change. And of course, as humans, we try to maximize efficiency. And that's why energy sources have varied both historically and regionally, depending on what is the cheapest and easiest source of energy, or what are the political frameworks within people are using energy. So in pre-industrial times, we had to use human muscle or animal muscle to get energy to have the capacity to do work or to produce change. This is, of course, extremely inefficient if you cannot use, for example, special machines to grow your crops, but you have to use your horse to do it. It's much less efficient. And that's also the reason why in pre-industrial times, humanity was much less wealthy compared to today. This all changed in the 17th century That's when we had the Industrial Revolution. And this revolution was powered by coal. And this is essentially one of our biggest evolutions in mankind that allowed us to mass produce all the goods we are using today. So the use of coal changed the world. But of course, it's not only coal that defines our energy system today. As I said, the energy we use, it depends on the regional aspects. And depending on those regional conditions, it depends where your energy source is the cheapest. In Saudi Arabia, it may be oil. In China, it may be solar. And in Germany, it may be wind energy. And these conditions are constantly changing. And this allows for this complex system where you have many energy sources continuously competing against each other and being traded across the world. So in the 17th century, we had coal. And then the next big revolution came in the 19th century. That's when we learned to use electricity powered by coal, and people started to have lighting in their homes. And in the late 19th century, we also learned how to use oil, especially powering cars and planes. Then later going down, beginning of the 20th century, we see the rise of low carbon electricity sources. So we had nuclear power and hydropower. And now finally, we're in the 21st century, which we can call the renewables age. Increasingly, we are using solar and wind to power our lives. But until today, it's still fossil fuels that dominate our energy systems. Fossils account for 80% of the energy we use. And we can also say that 20% of the energy we use is electricity. But within this electricity field, fossil fuels still play an important role. And we mostly use our energy for industry, transport, and as I've already said, electricity generation. But especially in the electricity sector, things are changing. Wind and solar have become cheaper than fossil fuels. And in countries like Denmark, 60% of electricity is powered by renewables.
It sounds like a magnificent technological advancement, how to use energy and how this has pretty much been the backbone of our economic development. But at the same time, there's this bleak aspect of energy consumption, and which is the fact that it emits pollution that has damaged our ecosystem, our world, and we are truly now facing this huge challenge of how not to destroy the place where we live, and that has made this push for renewables even stronger than before. Right, one of today's most debated topics in every country in the European Union is this big push for renewables, and where you should draw the line, because there's always ups and downs when these things happen. There's a huge car industry. There's a lot of people that work in there. So, of course, moving these sections and trying to push for other sources of energy will have impacts on our economic development and jobs. So that is why it's such a controversial topic for so many people. But at the same time, we cannot deny the fact that we do need to transition into less emission types of energy. So, Armis, we know that renewables are being cheaper every year, and there's this huge support from different governments to push for that. But I would like to ask you, maybe more on the technical, political side, how can we actually electrify these systems, and how can we actually decarbonize our energy systems?
So the renewables are very successful in the electricity part. So the first goal to decarbonize our energy systems is to increase the amount of electricity. So for example, if you think of industry and you think of steel production, for example, then you can use recycled steel and manufacture new steel using electricity instead of just using natural gas to get your new steel. But then, for example, if you got to come up with entirely new steel that is not recycled or repurposed, you cannot do it with electricity. And if you think of airplanes, you also cannot power big airplanes with electricity because the energy density of electricity is insufficient. If you would put a gigantic battery in an airplane, it wouldn't be able to fly because it's too heavy. And the gap we have here can be filled with renewable hydrogen. This is one of few proven methods that allow us to decarbonize our energy systems fully. And this works through an electrolyzer. So an electrolyzer can work with renewables. So, for example, A wind turbine powers this electrolyzer, and this electrolyzer can produce hydrogen. And this hydrogen has a lot of energy density, and it can be used already today to fully decarbonize our energy system. But the problem is that it is not competitive at the moment. If you use natural gas, it's cheaper. And if we told, for example, our industries here in Europe today, use renewable hydrogen and then compete at the global markets without any government support, it will not be possible. And this is the challenge we're facing right now. And this is where the industry needs the right political framework to get the business models working. And it may sound like a bit difficult because you need to come up with this solution, but the same was the case for many other clean technologies at the beginning of the 21st century. Wind and solar, they used to be not competitive at all. They were much more expensive than other sources of energy. But with the right political conditions, it became the cheapest source of electricity. And the same thing can happen with renewable hydrogen if we implement the right political framework.
At the end, this is a business. All these industries will try to look for profit. And whenever they can go for cheaper sources of energy, they will try to push for that. So I think that there's a lot of space here for governments to subsidize and help these cleaner energies to be a bit more competitive. I think that one of the main political priorities of the EU for this mandate, it's exactly that competitiveness, right? Like we're fighting against, in economic terms, against giants such as the US, such as China. So in order for European businesses to be competitive in that global market, you get it's maybe not so liberal for those liberal economists to help industries, but at the end, you will not be able to make these sources of energy competitive in those markets. And that's
yes, and one more dimension really I wanted to mention here. It's not only about increasing the subsidies for renewables, it's also about improving the legal situation because, for example, in Germany, it used to take many, many years to get a permit to build a wind farm, and then someone could interfere with that permit. The person could say, I don't want this wind turbine, and then go to a court, and it could take more than 10 years to get a permit, or after 10 years, you don't get a permit. So improving this legal situation, especially on a continent like Europe, where bureaucracy is a very significant factor, is important. And the other thing is that we are heavily subsidizing fossil fuels. So the issue is also that we just heavily incentivize using fossil fuels. And of course, this gives them a competitive edge.
Armis, and I think that makes me remember of the case, the example of Mexico. I mean, we know Mexico is a country that exports a lot of oil. It's been doing it for a long time. And there's this time on the national history of Mexico, the 1970s, where this oil boom gave the state a lot of money to develop its industry. So the current government has like this nationalist idea of that era, and they're trying to maybe replicate that bonanza. And it's a policy that was extremely criticized because they invested on a new refinery when it's an industry that a lot of people were saying that it should not be a long-term investment. We should maybe try to focus on solar energy, on the wind, different sources, on a country that has this opportunity. But we'll see if it changes a bit. The new elected president, she's actually a climate change scientist. So maybe there will be more of a focus on renewable energy and other sources. It would be nice. But I can think of many countries that oil has been its main drive, and they're trying to diversify. A lot of countries in the Persian Gulf are also trying to diversify into tourism because they know that oil has its days counted. So interesting dynamics, Aramis. And I think that now we're jumping a little bit into that geopolitical dimension of oil and energy markets. So maybe why don't we talk about that element? And as we said before, I mean, there is a strong connection between energy and politics, that this political nature, it's tied to supply and demand, which is a crucial element of global economic dynamics. And we can even say that our economy's backbone is pretty much constructed on the global energy supply. And during crises such as international conflicts, when the oil markets are volatile, prices go up and the public starts to outcry. In the last years, energy politics have grown to be really complex. In the US, in China, India, there's this heavy reliance on oil for transportation. Access to energy is essential, not just for transportation, but for economic growth and this rapid growth of populations in these growing economies. So the global energy dynamics have transformed energy and supply into true significant political leverage. I would like to ask you, how do you see the state of today's energy markets? Who do you think are the most powerful energy producing countries, and how do you think that the whole thing is shifting with this new element with renewable energy and this transition?
Yeah, I think from a geopolitical perspective, the two most important aspects from a national perspective are, on one hand, security of supply and price. If you have both, you're very powerful as a political player because you can fuel your own economy. Your economy is cheap. It has cheap input prices. So these are great conditions to compete on global markets. And on the other hand, if you have security of supply, so you're not dependent on foreign suppliers to get your energy, then of course you're less dependent on other actors, and this gives you more room of maneuver. And this is where one could say there was the historical mistake of Europe, because it only had one thing, not the other. It had cheap supply, but it didn't have security of supply. So it decided to rely on cheap Russian natural gas. And later it turned out that it is not cheap, in fact, and very expensive. And the price that Europe has been paying is the political dependence on Russia. And later on, when Europe decided not to go with Russia anymore as an energy partner, then it paid the real price. And that's where also renewables come into play, because if you deploy renewables, you have your source of energy locally, because you have the sun shining, you have the wind blowing. You don't need to import any foreign fuels to get your energy. And this means, from a geopolitical perspective, to have renewables is a huge advantage, because you have cheap energy and you have security of supply. And this is where I think things are changing for China, because China used to be quite vulnerable because they had to import a lot of energy, and this made them dependent on the suppliers. But it also made them vulnerable because they had to import this stuff through narrow trade passages, and the US had the opportunity to block these trade passages. And if they did, the Chinese economy would crumble. But now things are changing. China is the leader when it comes to the deployment of clean technology. They are building insane amounts of wind, insane amounts of solar, like no other country in the world. And this is helping them to improve on their security of supply. And they are also improving on the price side, because thanks to deploying these massive capacities, they are benefiting from the economies of scale. Another country I want to highlight here is the United States. They have also been historically quite vulnerable because they had to import their fossil fuels mostly from the Middle East. And, we discussed it many times in war diplomacy, all of these political dimensions that were involved here. For example, first they had great relations with Iran, then the Shah was ousted, then no oil coming from there. Then we had the war in Israel in the 1970s, I believe, and the huge oil crisis because the Saudis decided not to export their oil for the West. The US really learned the hard way that they are quite dependent. But then, thanks to these fracking technologies, they discovered that they can actually also use their own fossil fuels. And this has given the US the so-called shale oil revolution, and access to much cheaper energy, much more energy security. And now we're seeing that electricity prices in the US are quite low. So they have access to these cheap fossil fuels, to cheap gas. And on the other hand, they are also investing in clean tech as well. More than 500 billion invested in the clean tech sector in the last 2 years. Also thanks to this legal initiative from President Joe Biden, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. It gave a lot of tax incentives for the clean industry, and it has created a lot of jobs and a lot of new clean energy that the US is benefiting from. And then we have Europe, which doesn't have a lot of domestic fossil fuels, so they have to import a lot, which is a big incentive for them to scale up their renewables, which they are doing. Now there's a new discussion in Europe where potentially they should do more nuclear, and whether the EU should also support nuclear. So far, the EU has renewables targets for every country, and the major aspect that the European Commission has aimed for so far is to say, look, let's scale up those renewables, let's get those economies of scale working. But there's some countries that said, look, we've been relying on nuclear for a long time. We think it's our way to go. And of course, there's some political discussion going on how they want to decarbonize their energy systems. In India, you also have the clean transition going on, gradually picking up. They're increasingly deploying new solar and wind because they are cheaper than fossil fuels. This is helping India to get access of electricity to new households, but also to make electricity cheaper.
I would really put an emphasis on that energy independence element. I think that's the basic logic of the post-Ukraine energy security dilemma, at least here and I think that also the COVID pandemic made countries around the world to realize that supply chains are as important as any other, and energy is one of the most crucial ones for any country's economic developments. And I think that here another interesting topic that you touched is the resurgence of nuclear power. It is such a huge dilemma. A lot of people say this is also one of the ways to go, one of the industries where countries should invest. But of course, there's a lot of criticism regarding what the impacts of this could be, and not just because of accidents such as the ones that we saw in Japan, in Fukushima. And of course, the one that's always in our memory is the one in Ukraine, in Chernobyl in '86. But as well, because it takes such a huge investment from the state, and it gives returns in such a long term as well. And I remember reading a bit about smaller nuclear reactor type of factories. I'm not sure if you know a bit more about it, but I think it's one of the ways that maybe nuclear energy can still be developed. I think that at least Germany is one of the countries that are really against it. And well, you can compare that with France, which is a country that has a lot of nuclear facilities, and a lot of the nuclear energy in Europe is produced in France. So this is like two different sides of the coin.
Yes, I mean, it's also a political issue because there's so many jobs and a local industry tied to all of this. And of course, that they are also influencing politics in that way. So relating to nuclear, I think it's what we can say is that it reliably decarbonizes energy systems. It has a proven track record. Of course, there's always this moral dimension of whether things can go south. We had Fukushima, of course, in the last decade. It's ultimately a moral question of how you want to proceed here. I think one new dimension that we have to account for is sabotage, because you can launch cyber attacks against these nuclear plants and then horrible things could happen. Of course, there's a lot of work around securing these nuclear plants and taking care of that. But it has happened before that there was a cyber attack against a nuclear power plant. Iran was affected by this, allegedly by Israel. So why not the other way around? Why won't we see Iran potentially attacking nuclear facilities in Europe, or Russia doing this? It's quite a tricky question. And with nuclear, the thing is that your energy system is heavily centralized. So you rely on the single units. And if something happens with these single units, you're quite dependent on them. I think when it comes to nuclear, there was a great business case in the 70s and 80s where Europe was just deploying a lot of new nuclear capacity, and there was a great business case. But what we have seen in Europe in recent years is that when we got new nuclear reactors, massive cost overruns, massive delays, because there's a new generation of nuclear reactors, and the economies of scale are just not working here. So the argument that can be made here is, look, if the more we invest in one technology, the better the economies become. And what we have been doing in recent years is deploying a lot of renewables. And this is why many people are saying, look, let's continue to do that. But of course, you have certain local industries in France, in Czechia, where they say we have a lot of know-how in nuclear and we want to continue to invest into this.
Yeah, it's a complicated topic, and it's way more complex than I think we can even grasp on this short episode. I think we could talk about nuclear energy and politics for hours, but it's true that it's such a highly debated topic, and especially after those disasters that make you see that there's huge risks on investing in that. And then we haven't even talked about everything regarding to the waste and the storage of nuclear energy. I think that is another complicated thing. I remember once Sergio, another host here in War Diplomacy, said that the solution to everything is to shoot this up to space. and we were
I think
also
Trump suggested this as well.
Yes, I think so. I don't think that it would be safe to fly those things in space, in the atmosphere, but who knows? I'm sure there's a lot of technological progresses that we will see in the coming years that maybe I don't know, will give answers to these energy problems that we face today. I mean, the exponential growth of solar energy in the last years is also a topic that we could talk a bit about. And who knows, the progress in artificial intelligence and other types of technologies will give different sources of energy another chance and maybe improve their efficiency as well. But if armies, I think one thing is for certain is that the whole system is changing. It's definitely shifting into renewables, into other sources and low emission types. I think that the global trend is going there. And I don't think that one political leader, even if one of the most significant countries in international politics terms, has another opinion, they can break that trend. Like the same here in Europe with the right parties winning in the last election and everyone saying, well, the Green Deal is going to die. I mean, of course, there will be a political recentering of those type of policies, but you cannot break this huge trend. I mean, you're talking about investment, long-term investment, you're talking about industry. So maybe you can slow down the progress into that side of the equation, but to completely break away from it, I think that's going to be impossible. I mean,
this is for me, in fact, one of the most encouraging thing about the whole clean energy transition is that there is such a big consensus across the world that we need to decarbonize and that we need to do something about climate change. Now, of course, you will always have some disparities regionally about how you want to do this. But we see even Saudi Arabia importing their wind turbines and building new stuff. Or we have the United Arab Emirates, which have the company there called Masdar. It's supported by the state. And it has become one of the biggest companies investing in clean energy in the world. It's insane the amounts they are investing. We have the Paris Climate Agreement, which has been signed more or less by every country in the world. Trump temporarily got out of it, but generally speaking, there's such a huge consensus on that we need to do something. Now, of course, there's disagreement on how we need to do it. And one tricky aspect here that I also would like to mention is carbon capture and storage, because this is the solution to keep fossil fuels alive, to keep it in the system. So what is argued here is that they say, look, we continue to use fossil fuels, and it also makes sense to do that because one day we will just capture the carbon that is produced here. For example, I mentioned renewable hydrogen, but you can also produce so-called blue hydrogen. So this is when you would use gas to produce hydrogen, and then you capture the carbon emissions of the gas in the ground. Now, this is a hugely controversial solution because it's not a proven technology. So, for example, they found in a study in the US, it was 2 years ago, I think, that when they tried to implement this, so producing so-called blue hydrogen from natural gas, they actually produced more greenhouse gas emissions than with just regularly using natural gas, because so much carbon was leaking from this plant, they couldn't properly capture. So it's controversial if the solution is working. But for the fossil industry, it's a great argument to make to say, look, we can potentially still invest here. But the fact that they need to do this, the fact that they're not simply saying, oh yeah, let's just use fossil fuels for the rest of our lives, I think this is very interesting. And this is because we have this broad consensus in the world. And the fossil industry will either need to show that carbon capture is, first of all, working, and then they need to show it's competitive. And only then we will see a significant shift here. But until then, there will be a lot of momentum for all other technologies.
Yes, and maybe just also to conclude this conversation, I think that there's a lot of political backlash against all this progress in this field. And I listen a lot, like people over complaining about the 2030 agenda of the UN as if it was this conspiracy to attack our industries and the fields and stuff. I think that there's like this, like the far right and many extremes are trying to use this as like the main driver to attack everything that's against what they do, the status quo, right? And I understand that there is, like we said before, these ups and downs of any industry change, but we have to accept the fact that it's true that emissions are truly affecting our ecosystem. I mean, I think that the science is clear. People that deny climate change, I mean, I don't want to get in there, but I think that it's a reality that's impacting everywhere, and the lasting consequences, our generation will truly suffer them. So maybe it will be really, really hard to completely stop that climate change. But if there's anything that we can do to decrease its impact and maybe try to continue for the planet to be livable, I mean, we should at least try to fight for it. And I think that this is one of the truly most crucial times for this fight. And I think that our hearts, at least for most of the people that I live around with, are there. But there's so many people that are not. And I would like to ask you, as you said, you have bias, you work in the renewables field, but if there's some message that you could maybe try to put out there to people that might be a bit more hesitant to understand and maybe fall in line with this global shift into renewables and cleaner sources of energy, what could you say?
It's a bit difficult because I can, of course, make a lot of arguments and throw around the facts, but ultimately it's a question of who do you believe? Do you believe the scientists, the experts, or do you believe some pundits on the internet? And that's ultimately the question, because 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is a thing. Scientists and experts also agree that clean energies are feasible, that they are competitive, that they are good, that they do no harm to our health. But of course, we will always find people that come up with their own view who will say, no, it's not true for some reason, whatever interests are behind this. And ultimately, it's a question of who do you want to trust? And it will be absolutely crucial that the renewables industry and all the other clean tech industry will do their part in convincing people and also taking local concerns seriously. Because of course, if you install a wind turbine or a utility scale solar PV plant somewhere, it has an impact. I mean, it has a lot of positive impact. A lot of jobs are created. You have energy security, but of course it will have some impact on the visual landscape. And also it's the question of what do people get in return for living next to these places? These are the questions the industry has to be very transparent about and has to show its support for. And then I believe that it can not only work, it is working in so many European countries. For example, in Germany, you have so much wind energy. And the people in Germany, if you ask them in the opinion polls, you have a huge majority for renewables and for deploying more renewables. And then in countries where you don't have any renewables at all, people are concerned about having a bit. So it's really a question of being personally involved, getting access to the facts, and then this transition can work.
I agree. And just to say, I enjoyed a lot the conversation. I know that this is a topic you work with, and I knew it was going to be really interesting, really in depth. I think we could talk about every single different aspect of energy and global markets for hours. But I think that we did our best, try to touch about every single of the most important elements. And of course, we gave our geopolitical angle in there as well, which is the main subject of what we talk here in War Diplomacy. So thanks a lot for all the insights. I'm more than happy to see you back in Brussels when you come back in coming month. And yes, just to thank all our listeners for listening to us that follow us here in Spotify and any other podcast platform. And for more information on any of these topics, you can click on the couple links that we'll put in the description of the podcast. And if not, we have more than plenty of different subjects for you to listen in the show.
My pleasure. Take care, warriors. And until the next time.